This is Billy Kay with a major three-part series on the Declaration of Arbroath. Programme 1, The Declaration. I'm standing in the magnificent red sandstone ruin that is Arbroath Abbey. It was here on April 6, 1320, that nobles, barons, freeholders and the whole community of the realm of Scotland issued and sealed a remarkable document known today as the Declaration of Arbroath. Regarded as one of the first statements in history to define national sovereignty, it's left a profound legacy at home and abroad ever since.
It's the first protestations of democracy, and it's something that is so inherent in who we are. We do understand the democratic right of people.
And it is the earliest medieval European expression of the right to self-determination of a nation. And, it really deserves to be as well known globally as Magna Carta. But nonetheless, I think the reason it has survived the test of time as a document that inspires is because, in a way, it is a very modern document.
It's immensely powerful. It's beautiful. It's heartfelt. You feel that listening to it. There's a moral force to the wording. It's one of the great moral declarations, I think, one of the great moral declarations of the world.
For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory nor riches nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself.
It is a political document, and it should remind people of what cannot be denied, which is that Scotland was an independent kingdom, and there was a moment in its history where that had to be asserted.
Dovett Brune of Glasgow University, historian Fiona Watson, actor Brian Cox, writer Alexander McCall-Smith, and a pupil from Hayshead Primary School in Arbroath on a seminal document from a defining moment in our nation's history. It began with two deaths, King Alexander III in 1286 and his successor and granddaughter, the Maid of Norway, in 1290. According to one of our greatest historians, Geoffrey Barrow, this produced a crisis caused by the extinction of the oldest royal dynasty in Christendom. In 1290, no other kingdom of Europe could claim with equal conviction to be governed by a royal house enjoying an unbroken existence of 7 centuries. Michael Brown of St Andrews University.
By the later 13th century, I think you have arrived at a situation where across Europe, Scotland is recognised as a defined kingdom on a par with other kingdoms. A sense of Scottishness that was shared by very different sorts of people, townsmen from as far south as Berwick up to the inhabitants of Wester Ross or Argyll, were bound into this structure of identifying with Alexander as their king. And I think looking back, that seemed a palpable age of plenty and security.
When Alexander our king was deed, that Scotland led in law and lee, a wa was sown so ale and breed, o wine and wax, o gaming and glee. Our gowd was changed into lead. Christ born in virginity, succour Scotland and remede that is stayed in perplexity. What do you feel about that poem and the way it describes that period?
I think it's a very evocative poem, and I think it encapsulates that sense that the world that Alexander III had inhabited had gone, and they're in a period of perplexity.
For many in the 14th century, evoking Alexander III as a way of thinking about before the war.
Steve Boardman of Edinburgh University. Faced with the prospect of several powerful competitors for the throne, the Scottish Guardians sought arbitration from Edward I of England, who was far from neutral in his designs or in his choice of John Balliol as king.
It's a case of the lesser of two evils. Edward is a worrying, dangerous, risky option, but also it's probably to them seems better than the alternative.
Initially, he's hoping to set up this dual monarchy. And when that goes awry, when Margaret dies before she arrives in Scotland on her trip back from Norway, Edward sees the possibility of another solution, one which would have his authority in Scotland acknowledged in one way or another.
He sees the act of homage that John Balliol does to him, recognising him as his superior lord, not simply entitling him, but requiring him to take an active role in Scotland, to make demands on Scotland which the Scots aren't comfortable with. So what has been the final judgment of the King of Scots in any matter in Scotland can now be taken to Edward. And Edward uses that, I think, to make a series of statements about his authority over John Balliol, treating him, as he says, as any other baron of my kingdom.
Edward humiliates Balliol and forces him to resign his kingship, going as far as having the royal Scottish arms ripped from Balliol's surcoat. From now on, he'd be known as Tomb Tabard, or Empty Coat. The Scots entered into a military pact with Philip IV of France in 1295, the birth of the Auld Alliance.
The French alliance is a decisive moment. It gives the Scots the possibility of finding the support in Europe to remove Edward by force. And it also, I think, for Edward, demonstrates a clear act of rebellion.
Balliol is more or less forced into an act of defiance, and it goes, as you might anticipate, very, very badly.
And in a blitzkrieg of 14 weeks, he overruns Scotland.
There's no doubt that the fate of Berwick is meant to be exemplary. It's meant to intimidate. It's meant to be an example of shock and awe.
I think it is a huge culture shock. And of course, part of that, you have the Ragman roll, which is the formal submission of over 1,000 individual Scots. So we're talking a situation that's moved from a dispute between, if you like, Edward I and John Balliol and his councillors, to a dispute which is now involving a much wider group of Scots for whom this is completely without precedent.
This army emerges in 1297, which seems to be driven by different grievances. It's an army that is generated by its first experience of contact with an English colonial administration that is looking to sort of take more from peasant farmers. It's asking the Scottish yeomanry to fight in overseas wars. These would be genuinely shocking developments. And so a number of historians have suggested that Wallace, his rebellion, is actually pointing to something really much deeper, that is almost a peasant's rebellion against English royal government.
I think it would be fair to say that the Wars of Independence galvanises it. I mean, obviously there had to be something worth fighting for everyone from top to bottom, because the nobility of Scotland and the middling sort and the peasantry all in different ways decide, even when the nobility are absent in prison, people underneath them are prepared to get up and fight without them. There has to be something that they all believe in, that they think is worth going through considerable difficulty for themselves, their families, in order to preserve this something called Scotland. So I think we can say that there is definitely a national identity before the wars. But the wars galvanise. I mean, really, it is a crucible of something very, very different, something much deeper, angrier, blacker than had gone before. I think probably on both sides of the border, the bitterness that these wars generates and the hatred between Scots and English, which is so ironic given how close the relationship between the two kingdoms were just before the outbreak of war. I think it's an absolute tragedy.
In 1301, the chronicler Baldred Bissett declared that Edward's mission was the perpetual annihilation of all the blood, nation and name of the Scots. The massacre of several thousand men, women and children in Scotland's principal borough of Berwick and the brutality of the occupying army provoked resistance, led first by William Wallace, then by one Robert the Bruce, crowned King of Scots at Scone in 1306.
From Edward I's perspective, they are traitors and rebels. Bruce's 3 younger brothers are executed when they're captured by Edward I's forces. And if he'd fallen into Edward I's hands, he would have met the same fate. So what he does in 1306 is a huge gamble. The killing of Comyn is clearly a pivotal event in Bruce's life. But Bruce killing Comyn puts him in a position where he either goes forward or he gives up completely, and he chooses to press on.
He came back in 1307 a changed man and one of the greatest military leaders Scotland's ever had, but probably of medieval Europe, considering that he did not have the resources that kings of England or France could command, and look what he achieved. And he never stopped. That's the thing about Robert Bruce. People say, oh, he wavered. No, he never wavered. He was absolutely single-minded. It was about promoting his right to the throne of Scotland. And if that meant he had to change sides because things changed, he would do that. But it was always for the same goal. I don't have any truck with this. He's whiter than white, and he was always on the side of the angels. He wasn't. But for Scotland, thank goodness Robert Bruce came along.
This tune, Scots Wahey, was an anthem of the Old Alliance and inspired Bruce's men at Bannockburn.
The Battle of Bannockburn is the ultimate trial by combat. Who has the right? And God had given the judgment that it was in fact Robert.
It's the one which is at the crucial point where he needs a demonstration to those Scots who have still not recognised him as king that he is the future.
He's done all he can militarily, obviously the Battle of Bannockburn, but also taking Scottish territory back, Berwick being retaken in 1318. So there is still work to do in the diplomatic field to get this firmly established. And Pope is a bit like the equivalent to the UN these days. If you're not recognised by the Pope, you're not really there.
In essence, the Declaration of Arbroath is a letter to the Pope responding to the charges that he was in some way a rebel, was not deserving of any kind of kingship.
But it becomes pretty clear that the Pope is going to excommunicate. I mean, now Bruce himself is excommunicated, but that he's going to excommunicate Scotland, which is a big deal. That means you can't be born, you can't die or get married, basically, within the church. And there's a kind of hope among the English in particular that this will drive people back into non-Bruce hands. Scotland's future is hanging by a thread. And yet it doesn't seem, on the face of it, to faze. He is just thinking of anything and everything he can do to win international acceptance for Scotland's independence and for his right to rule Scotland. And that is why he writes, or he gets his propagandists, probably his chancellor, to write this incredible document.
May it please you to admonish and exhort the King of the English, who ought to be satisfied with what belongs to him, since England used once to be enough for 7 kings or more, to leave us Scots in peace, who live in this poor little Scotland, beyond which there is no dwelling place at all, and covet nothing but our own. We are sincerely willing to do anything for him, having regard to our condition that we can, to win peace for ourselves.
This letter was composed at a time of insecurity for Bruce. Some of the barons who attached their seals to it, for example, were involved in a plot to overthrow him and replace him with John Balliol's son Edward, who was waiting in the wings with English support. Bruce was vulnerable too, because the death of his brother Edward had left the country without an heir once again. Despite all of this, the Declaration succeeds in placing Scotland firmly within a European intellectual tradition, explored here by Hector McQueen of Edinburgh University and Nicky Scott of Historic Environment Scotland.
Well, we're at Arbroath Abbey, which was one of the finest abbeys in medieval Scotland, with one of the largest churches, over 90 metres long originally, founded by William I in the late 1100s. It was one of the most substantial foundations in Scotland. It was a royal foundation, and William and subsequent monarchs, subsequent nobles, lavished large amounts of money on it. So as well as the remains of the church that survived today, there would have been the cloister building, there would have been dozens of people lived here, there would have been at least 20 plus monks. On top of that, there would have been the assistants, people who came in from the town to help with chores. There would have been workmen here carrying out repairs. There would have been people in and out to visit the church. So it would have been a very lively, active place. I mean, it's quite serene these days, but it would have been a hive of activity back in the days of the Declaration.
I think it was a European debate into which the Declaration of Arbroath was playing, and it was playing through these very well-educated churchmen.
There were visits by leading Scots to Paris during the period that Duns Scotus was working in Paris. And it's unthinkable that a leading Scottish churchman such as William Lamberton would have gone to Paris and not sought out the views of Duns Scotus.
And it's here that Bruce's Chancellor, Abbot Bernard, is based. So that's probably why the declaration is issued from here. Bernard would have controlled the Great Seal, the scriptorium, the royal chancery, so the production of all royal documents were probably done under his administration. So here would have had the mechanisms for producing the parchment, producing the ink, having the seal matrices, the wax available. So all that paraphernalia that was required for creating a document as important as a declaration would have been here. Looking at the abbot's house, this would have been the more private residence of the abbot. When nobles came from far and wide to fix their seal to the declaration, it is very possible that the declaration was in this space for at least some of its time at Arbroath.
As a historian, as somebody close to it, what do you feel about it?
I think it does perhaps get taken out of context and used for particular political purposes nowadays, but the fact that it shows medieval Scots having the sophistication to produce something like this, that shows awareness of classical literature. We know that Arbroath had a very extensive library, which would have been very important for the creation of the Declaration. It's aware of Irish politics, English politics, continental examples. This is a hugely sophisticated political kingdom that is really learning how to articulate its belief in itself. Yes, it's a wonderful statement of political independence, but it's the sophistication of the argument that really highlights how embedded in the wider political, social, economic world of medieval Europe Scotland was.
Quite apart from its significance to Scottish national identity, the Declaration is considered to be a magisterial example of medieval Latin rhetoric. This is how Lord Cooper described it in 1951. There is still much to be learned from that remarkable manifesto. Read it again and judge for yourselves whether it does not deserve on its merits to be ranked as one of the masterpieces of political rhetoric of all time.
Non enim propter gloriam, divisias, aut honores pugnamus, sed propter libertatem solum modo, quam nemo bonus, nisi simul cum vita amitit.
It's a prose rhythm called the cursus, and it's like making a statement of international significance that's immediately recognised as such. In this context, it's not unusual to write it in this cursus style, but they've gone a step further. They've made it this amazingly eloquent, relatively brief piece of prose. So we've got to imagine whoever it is that's behind all this ultimately is a wordsmith of genius.
It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself.
Brian Cox with the famous Freedom Passage, which echoes lines from the Roman historian Sallust in his Catiline Conspiracy, and Ian Forrester, the UK's last judge in the General Court of the European Union, declaiming the Latin original. More revolutionary is the deposition clause, where they state that sovereignty lies with the Scottish people and they have the power to depose any king who does not defend their status as an independent nation. This was also influenced by a Scot who was a European intellectual giant, Alexander Brodie of Glasgow University.
This was a time when Duns Scotus was the single greatest theologian living, working, writing in Europe. Duns Scotus has provided us with a very rich conceptual framework for placing Edward I amongst the unjust rulers of the world. And what lies underneath all this is the concept that the people should elect a sovereign.
And do you think that the famous clause in the Declaration of deposing King Robert, if he reneges on his promises to the people, that could come from a direct influence from Duns Scotus's philosophy?
I'm certain of it. We are a free people. We can change our minds.
The other message is, you may think you can kill Robert Bruce and get rid of him. We will elect another who will defend the realm and maintain its independence.
It had become more important for most Scots that the man who was king was keeping them out of England's clutches than that he should be, strictly speaking, the rightful king. And I think that's why it's so revolutionary, because they're saying that the freedom of the kingdom is more important than the person who rules it. And that flies in the face of medieval theories about kingship, when, to be honest, you just have to put up with them, no matter how bad they are. So this rhetoric of freedom, which the document kind of leads you to that point, to the soaring rhetoric, for so long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never in any degree be subject to the dominion of the English, which is revolutionary for Europe. That is not what should determine a nation's future. It should just be whoever should be king is the one to whom it belongs as a property right. But no, they're saying something different. The only person we will accept as king is someone who keeps us free of the English. And that's a definite sign to Edward Balliol. Edward Balliol is not the rightful king because he would bring English dominion. So they have a very particular audience in mind. Yes, the Pope. But, the English would be coming at the Pope to say, no, the Robert Bruce isn't the rightful king. It's this man here, Edward Balliol. And Robert Bruce's guys are saying, no, there's something more important here.
We are bound to him for the maintaining of our freedom, both by his rights and merits, as to him by whom salvation has been wrought unto our people, and by him, come what may, we mean to stand. Yet, if he should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we would strive at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own right and ours, and we would make some other man who was able to defend us, our king.
The idea of Robert Bruce surrendering the kingdom to the English is simply utterly absurd. He would never do that, or at least if he did, it would be committing suicide. And it was absolutely against the whole purpose of his existence. It is a bit like the SNP government suddenly saying, well, actually, let's forget about independence, and actually, let's forget about devolution as well. Let's just call it quits and be part of England.
What it's doing is underlining the point that the man who should be king is the man who does not hand Scotland over to the English. So it's just underlining that point, and again saying we're not having Edward Balliol because he would not do that.
I think it's unique in its rhetorical power and force. The thing that struck me looking at it again is that underlying it, there are certain ideas about law which were very much universal in the Middle Ages. In particular, the 3 precepts of the Roman law, which was part of the common law, if you like, of the whole of Western Europe at this time. And these 3 precepts were to live honestly, harm no one, and render unto each his own. And if you look at the Declaration, you see, first of all, this claim that King Edward I had not dealt honestly with the Scots, that he had made claims against them which harmed them, led to deaths. And then finally, the Pope is asked to render unto the Scots what is their own, this poor little kingdom which has been in the possession of Scottish kings for hundreds of years.
In their kingdom, there have reigned 113 kings of their own royal stock, the line unbroken by a single foreigner.
It's been described as a pedigree of a nation. And I think the Scots are assembling materials that have been started to be written during the previous 50 to 100 years, which gives Scotland the same kind of mythological history that other European nations are developing for themselves. So the links with Troy, the links with the Bible and the movement of the Israelites in the Bible, the passage through different regions of the world to finally arrive at your designated homeland.
You get the origin myths, where Scotland had come from. This Egyptian lady, Scota, whose husband was a Greek, Gathalos. Now, there's a very interesting reason why he was a Greek, and that's because the English origin myths had a Trojan in theirs. And of course, we all know that the Greeks beat the Trojans, just making that little point there. So you have to have your classical bit in your origin myths, and then, of course, you've got the biblical allusions.
Well, as so often happens, we tend to go for near the top in these matters. So having Andrew as your patron, brother of Peter, of course, that's going fairly near the top.
They claim they were the lost tribe of Israel.
Yes, absolutely. And it's almost the first Christians in the West.
Legend has it that St Andrew preached to the Scythians in the region of the Black Sea, which, according to the Declaration, was an ancient homeland of the Scots. Next, we'll hear how the Declaration reached places as far apart as America, Germany and Corsica. But we'll end in the North Caucasus Mountains of Greater Scythia with historian Rebecca Wills.
We were hiking in the Caucasus Mountains in Georgia, and we came across border guards on the border with Ingushetia, Chechnya and Dagestan in the middle of nowhere in the high mountains. They asked us where we were from at Kudavui. I said, Shotlandia, Scotland. And at that they cried out, they said, Shotlandia! And they invited the whole family, me, my husband and the 2 small children, inside the razor wire. They put down thermarests for us to sit on. They fed us with some of their rations. And we had a lovely discourse about Scotland. And they were aware, partly through films like Braveheart, but partly through the Scottish campaign over so many years for our independence, that here was another small mountainous country that they could identify with. And at one point, one of these border guards started quoting in Russian translation from the Declaration of Arbroath. And I was so taken aback. And he quoted the bit about freedom, which no honest man gives up but with his life, that famous line. They were so positive about Scotland. I thought that we should sing them something, so my 8-year-old son and I sang them Flower of Scotland. At which point the Georgian took his hat off, got down on one knee, and I could see he had tears coming out of his eyes, and he appreciated that we were a small country about to vote in a referendum for our independence, and that we shared our aspirations with the Georgian people.